Montana Territory. Early December, 1883. The most respected master builder in Silverbow County stood at the edge of a windswept hillside, shaking his head in absolute disgust. Behind him, three other prominent men of the settlement, a timber merchant, a blacksmith, and a local sawmill operator, stared at the exact same patch of frozen earth. What they saw made them laugh out loud. Not the polite kind of laughter you share over a warm cup of coffee, but the cruel, arrogant kind. The kind of laughter that comes from men who think they know everything about a harsh land, watching a newcomer do something completely unbelievable. That, said the builder, pointing a gloved finger at the hillside, is the dumbest, most dangerous thing I have ever seen a human attempt in this territory. What had these hardened frontier men so worked up? A hole. A doorway built directly into the side of a modest hill, where an ancient natural depression in the earth had created a shallow cove. And inside that clay-lined alcove, a 34-year-old Norwegian immigrant was constructing something the town had never witnessed before. A cabin that looked like it belonged inside an old European fairy tale, half buried in the soil, with thick sod and living wild grass packed onto the roof structure, and a low round door that looked more like an animal burrow than a proper American home. The town called it a death trap. They called it a fool's grave, a waste of good timber, and a shameful insult to proper craftsmanship. They whispered that the man's pride would leave his young family frozen solid before the new year arrived. Yet by the middle of February, those exact same men would be standing inside that very cabin with wooden rulers, pulling out notebooks, measuring stone walls, taking technical notes, and asking desperate questions they were far too proud to ask in December. Today, you are going to understand why the worst idea in Silverbow County became the most copied shelter design in 3 mountain valleys, and why modern construction completely forgot what this quiet immigrant remembered about working with the laws of physics instead of fighting against them. If you are ready to discover one proven frontier engineering technique that kept a family warm when survival depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. We release a new long-form document every week, uncovering the hidden engineering genius buried inside primitive and historical survival methods. And smash that like button if you believe there is deep wisdom in the old ways that modern civilization has lost. Drop a comment below right now, telling me where you are watching from and what was the coldest winter temperature you have ever faced in your life. I read every single story you share. Now, let us turn back the clock to December 1883 and meet the man everyone in Montana called crazy. His name was Henrik Voss. He was 34 years old, a Norwegian immigrant, a carpenter by trade, and exceptionally stubborn by nature. He had already spent 2 full winters in Montana Territory, and during those 24 cold months, he had observed something the local settlers had completely failed to realize. Their homes were losing a devastating war against the cold. Walk into almost any standard log cabin in Silverbow County during that freezing December, and you would find the exact same structural design. 4 walls of chinked pine or spruce logs, elevated 2 to 3 feet off the frozen ground on loose stone piers to prevent the timbers from rotting in the damp spring soil. A massive central fireplace constructed from heavy river stone. A tall, open chimney, engineered to pull a strong upward draft. And hand-sawn wooden plank floors with gaps between the boards wide enough that you could look straight down and see daylight through the floorboards. It was considered the right way to build. It was the standard way everyone constructed shelter from Canada down to Colorado. It was the proven method that the most experienced builders in the entire region swore by with their livelihoods. And it was bleeding thermal energy like a slaughtered animal. Henrik had watched his neighbors through his first 2 winters. He had watched them feed their towering river rock fireplaces like hungry beasts that could never be filled. Day after day, men were lugging 80 pounds of dried firewood into their homes. On bitter nights, that number climbed to 100 pounds or more. Every single day, from the beginning of November all the way through the end of March, adult men spent half of their limited daylight hours doing nothing but felling trees, splitting logs, hauling heavy bundles through deep snowdrifts, and stacking cord after cord of wood against their outer walls. And for what? All that brutal physical labor produced a home that might barely reach 50 degrees Fahrenheit on the warmest afternoon, assuming you were standing directly in front of the open hearth. If you walked 15 feet away toward the outer walls, the temperature dropped into the 30s. Water buckets sitting on kitchen tables routinely froze solid overnight, just 10 paces away from a roaring fire. The problem was not a lack of hard work. The men and women living on the Montana frontier were some of the toughest, most resilient people on the continent. They knew how to labor until their hands bled. The problem was fundamental physics, and thermal physics does not care how tough you think you are. Cold air is significantly heavier and denser than warm air. As the open fires burned inside those conventional cabins, hot air rushed straight up the tall stone chimneys. That upward draft created a powerful negative pressure zone inside the room. To equalize that pressure, freezing outdoor air was violently sucked upward through those wide gaps in the wooden floors, pulling cold directly from the shaded crawlspace underneath the cabin. Then there was the wind, the relentless, merciless Montana wind that raced under those elevated foundations, constantly scouring heat from the underside of the floorboards faster than any fireplace could ever generate warmth from above. The solid wood walls presented another severe weakness. While green or seasoned timber feels substantial, solid wood logs have a surprisingly poor capacity for thermal storage. They absorbed a tiny amount of heat during the sunny afternoon, only to radiate that warmth straight out into the freezing night sky hours later. And those impressive Riverstone chimneys? When the wind blew down the valley at 40 miles per hour, the pressure differential turned those beautiful hearths into massive vacuum tubes, sucking the warm, comfortable indoor air out of the living space and dumping it straight into the freezing wilderness above. Henrik sat down with a piece of scrap wood and a stub of lead pencil to do the thermodynamic math in his head. Consider a single frontier family of 4 burning 90 pounds of split firewood every single day across a 5-month mountain winter. That equals 13,500 pounds of fuel, more than 6.5 tons of heavy timber that had to be chopped down, cut into rounds, split by hand, stacked to dry, carried inside, and consumed in a fire every single year, just to keep the interior space barely warm enough to prevent hypothermia. He knew there had to be a better way to construct a home. He found the answer during a long walk in late October, while scouting timber along the boundary of the old Jacobson property. His dog, a thick-coated Norwegian elkhound named Bjorn, had wandered off the main wagon track, sniffing around the base of a low, sweeping hill. The geographical feature was not dramatic. It was perhaps 20 feet tall at its highest crest, featuring a wide, natural depression carved into its eastern slope. It was not a cave, just a shallow earth alcove where centuries of rainwater and winter runoff had slowly eroded softer topsoil, leaving behind a hard wall of dense clay, sandstone, and compacted earth. It was the exact kind of terrain feature that 100 different homesteaders would walk past every day without giving it a second thought. Henrik stood at the base of that earth wall for 20 minutes without moving a muscle, just watching and calculating. Bjorn walked right into the middle of the earthen depression, laid down flat against the dirt wall out of the biting autumn wind, and fell fast asleep within minutes. As Henrik watched his dog rest in comfort, a memory flashed back from his youth in Scandinavia. He remembered his grandfather showing him centuries-old storage cellars dug deep into Norwegian hillsides. Those ancient earth cellars were always cool and dry in the heat of July, yet they never froze solid during the darkest days of January. The mass of the earth itself acted as an unstoppable thermal buffer, holding structural temperatures steady, while the open atmosphere above swung wildly between extreme hot and extreme cold. Then another memory surfaced. He recalled seeing detailed field sketches in an old book describing indigenous architecture across the northern plains and western territories. Native peoples had spent thousands of years perfecting lodges that were dug partially below the surface of the earth. They did not build those pit houses for ritual or appearance. They built them for winter survival because staying below the surface meant staying alive. A critical engineering question formed inside Henrik's mind. What would happen if you stopped building a shelter on top of the ground and instead built your shelter directly inside it? Without hesitating, He located the owner of the property and purchased the 4-acre hillside parcel for cash. The seller openly mocked him after receiving the coins, convinced he had just scammed a foolish foreigner. The land was far too rocky for growing crops, far too steep for cattle grazing, and completely unsuitable for standard home construction. Maverick Henrik paid the fee, picked up his tools, and went to work. He began excavating in early November. But he did not dig straight down like a man digging a well. He carved horizontally back into that natural eastern slope, clearing out the depression and expanding it deep into the heart of the hill. The physical labor was punishing. Frozen clay, compacted gravel, and buried sandstone boulders do not give up ground easily to a pickaxe and shovel. Yet Henrik realized his excavation method had one massive physical advantage that none of the local critics understood. He was not fighting gravity. Gravity was helping him. Every heavy shovel full of dense soil he loosened was rolled out horizontally on a wooden cart, moving down the natural slope with minimal effort, rather than being lifted straight up out of a deep pit. By the middle of November, he had cleared a clean, level, rectangular footprint. The space measured roughly 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep, framed smoothly by the natural slope of the hill. The back wall of his new living space was not something he built out of timber. It was a structural feature that nature had spent thousands of years preparing. It was a solid, continuous face of ancient, dense clay, interlocked with natural sandstone. It felt cold to the touch when he placed his bare hand against it in mid-November, but Henrik knew that cold was stable, consistent, and predictable. He leveled the dirt floor carefully, then covered the entire surface with smooth, flat stones collected from nearby creek beds, settling each slab firmly into a 4-inch bed of coarse river sand. It was simple, solid, completely sealed against burrowing pests, positioned well below the local frost line, and permanently sheltered from the bitter prairie wind. Then came the part of his construction project that ignited absolute fury among the local tradesmen. While every traditional builder in Silverbow County was busy raising elevated timber walls to keep the wilderness out, Henrik began constructing a specialized structural element designed to hold internal heat in. He built an interior wall along the back northern face of the room. It stood 6 feet high, measured 2 full feet in thickness, and was constructed entirely from heavy slabs of dense sandstone that he quarried and hauled from a nearby ridge. When completed, that single internal masonry wall contained over 6,000 pounds of solid rock. Each stone was painstakingly fitted by hand, chinked with native clay mortar, and layered with clear structural intent. This stone structure was not just a fireplace accent, it was a massive thermal battery. Henrik positioned his small cast-iron firebox directly against the center of that massive sandstone wall, rather than placing it out in the middle of the room or building an open stone chimney on an external wood wall. His engineering logic was razor-sharp. Let the concentrated heat of the fire soak directly into those 6,000 pounds of stone during the day, and let that massive warm battery slowly radiate gentle, steady thermal energy back into the living space for 8 to 12 hours after the fire went out. The remaining 3 structural walls, the east side, the west side, and the partial south-facing front wall, were constructed using thick, hand-notched pine logs, fitted together with extreme precision. But here is the detail that made the town's master builder shake his head in disbelief. Henrik did not elevate those log walls on stone piers. The bottom sill log sat directly on a buried stone foundation, resting barely 8 inches above his interior stone floor level. There was no crawl space under the house. There was no open air gap. There was no empty space beneath the floorboards for the winter wind to race through and steal heat from below. And then there was the roof. This was the feature that made people literally laugh out loud when they rode past on horseback. Instead of building a traditional steep-pitched wooden roof covered in thin cedar shakes, Henrik laid down heavy, thick timber rafters made from peeled Douglas fir trunks. Across those massive beams, he laid tight wooden tongue-and-groove decking, covered it with a waterproof layer of natural birch bark and thick clay soil, and then shoveled 18 full inches of dense earth directly onto the top of the structure. On top of that deep soil layer, he transplanted living wild sod grass, the exact same native buffalo grass that grew naturally on the surrounding hillsides. When he was finished, it appeared as though the mountain slope had simply swallowed his cabin whole. The structure looked like an organic mound, seamlessly blending back into the landscape. Finally, Henrik constructed the entrance. He did not install a standard wooden door leading directly from the warm living room out into the freezing open air. Instead, he built an 8-foot-long covered entrance tunnel that angled slightly upward from the outside slope down toward the interior threshold. He installed 2 heavy insulated wooden doors, one at the outer entrance of the tunnel and a second door at the inner entrance to the cabin. It was a natural thermodynamic airlock. Cold air, being dense and heavy, naturally wants to fall and sink. Henrik's angled tunnel design forced incoming cold air to drop down and trap itself inside the outer entryway, preventing it from surging into the main living quarters when the inner door was opened. Warm air, being light, naturally wants to rise. The low subterranean ceiling geometry kept that light, warm air trapped firmly inside the high points of the living area, preventing it from escaping out into the night. To ensure fresh, clean air without sacrificing thermal efficiency, Henrik installed 2 small, precise ventilation tubes. One 6-inch intake pipe was placed low on the eastern wall, positioned where prevailing winter winds created gentle, positive pressure. A second 6-inch exhaust pipe was installed high up through the sod roof near the western edge, where wind blowing across the mound created a constant negative pressure vacuum. This simple pressure differential pulled fresh, oxygen-rich outside air in low across the room, while allowing stale air and cooking moisture to exit high near the ceiling. It operated purely on natural convection, the exact same physical principle that makes a chimney function without needing a wide-open, heat-stealing fireplace flue. The local community did not see sophisticated passive engineering when they looked at Henrik's creation. They saw utter madness. They saw a primitive subterranean hole dug by an uneducated foreigner who was far too cheap to buy proper timber and build a real house. Now, picture this scene unfolding in the heart of Silverbow County as November slipped away into December. The leader of the local critics was a man named Charles Brennan. Brennan was 46 years old, a veteran master builder who had spent over 20 years constructing homes across Montana Territory. Most of those 2 decades had been spent swinging heavy axes, felling virgin pine, milling straight timbers, and laying elevated stone foundations. He had personally built 43 log cabins between the towns of Helena and Butte. 43 homesteading families trusted his hands with their winter shelter. That long track record earned him enormous respect, immense authority, and a deep sense of professional pride. And Charles Brennan despised Henrik Voss's earth cabin with a burning passion that surprised even his closest friends. It was not personal at first. Brennan barely knew the quiet Scandinavian. Henrik kept to himself, spoke plain English, and did not waste breath on idle saloon gossip. What bothered Brennan was the structural precedent. If newcomers started believing they could simply carve holes into muddy hillsides, stack sod on dirt roofs, and call it proper human housing, then everything Brennan had spent 20 years teaching this territory would be thrown into question. Worse yet, what if it somehow worked? What if, by some bizarre miracle, that strange grass-topped earth burrow actually kept a family warm through a mountain freeze? If that happened, Brennan's traditional labor-intensive timber cabins would instantly look inefficient, overly expensive, and scientifically flawed. He could not allow that idea to take root in the settlement. The first major public confrontation took place on December 22nd at the Silverbow Mercantile Store. Henrik had walked into town to buy lamp oil, coarse salt, and a 50-pound sack of baking flour. Brennan was already inside the warm shop, standing near the big iron belly stove alongside Samuel Cross, the area's primary timber merchant, Robert Dunlap, the local blacksmith, and at least 10 other local settlers. It was the kind of bitterly cold Saturday afternoon where anyone with common sense stayed inside, crowding around a fire and talking about the weather. When Henrik walked through the front door, the store went dead silent. Brennan did not shout. He did not need to raise his voice. He simply stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the younger carpenter, speaking in the measured tone of an experienced father scolding a reckless child. "Voss," Brennan said, his voice echoing off the dry wooden shelves. "I need to say something to you, and I'm saying it right here in front of witnesses, because I want it clearly on the public record." Henrik paused, set his flour sack down onto the wooden floorboards, and waited in silence. "That structure you are digging into the Jacobson Hill," Brennan continued, shaking his head slowly, "that damp hole in the dirt is going to kill your young family before spring arrives. And when it does, I do not want a single person in this county saying I did not step up and warn you." The air inside the mercantile store grew colder than the breeze outside. "And how exactly will it kill us, Mr. Brennan?" Henrik asked softly. "Moisture and air stagnation," Brennan answered immediately, counting off points on his calloused fingers. "Moisture from your breath, moisture from your bodies, moisture from boiling cooking pots. It will have nowhere to go inside a buried dirt box. It will saturate your exposed wall timbers from the inside out. By February, your living space will be dripping with black mold. By March, your structural roof beams will rot through. And then those 18 inches of wet dirt on your roof will cave in, crushing you and your wife while you sleep." "My cabin features 2 dedicated ventilation channels," Henrik replied calmly. "Ventilation?" Brennan scoffed, laughing out loud. "2 tiny 6-inch holes are not nearly enough to manage the humidity load of human beings living inside an underground hole. You need 10 times that airflow to keep wood dry. And if you had 10 times that airflow, you would blow every ounce of heat straight out into the sky. You have trapped yourself in an impossible engineering trap." Henrik said nothing, letting the older builder finish his speech. "And that is assuming you even survived the first true northern blizzard," Brennan added, warming up to his audience. "You have got 1 wall made of quarry stone, and the rest is timber buried against raw dirt that is going to wick ground moisture straight into the wood grain. When that timber freezes, swells, and contracts, your clay chinking will fall out in chunks. The mountain wind will find every crack, and you will be colder in that dirt burrow than anyone else in this valley." Samuel Cross, the timber merchant who made his living supplying firewood and milled lumber, jumped into the conversation right behind Brennan. "And even if your wood does not rot," Cross sneered, "you are going to burn through firewood faster than any family in Montana. I have seen your wood stack, Voss. 4 cords, that is all you cut. 4 tiny cords of split wood. I sell 12 cords of seasoned pine to families your exact size, and most of them barely make it to April without buying more. 4 cords in an underground hole is a joke. Being buried 4 feet deep means you are buried away from the sun," Brennan added, enjoying the mathematical logic of his argument. "Look at the cabins I build. Elevated foundations. Massive south-facing glass windows that catch the afternoon solar rays. That is free heat, Voss. Passive solar energy. By burying your walls deep inside a hill, you have completely eliminated solar gain. You are relying entirely on wood combustion in a tiny, air-starved box. By January, you will be trying to burn wet, smoky wood because your chimney will fail to pull a draft." A voice from the back of the crowd shouted out, "One lone spark will set that dry grass roof on fire like kindling. You built a funeral pyre." "It is living prairie sod," Henrik answered, his voice remaining level. "The roots retain natural capillary moisture, even in winter." "It is December, Voss," Brennan countered sharply. "There is no moisture in that grass. There is only frozen frost and dry vegetation. You built a thatched roof on a dugout and convinced yourself it is fireproof." Robert Dunlap, the blacksmith, was not a cruel man. He stepped forward with a gentler, more practical tone. "Henrik," Dunlap said, "I know you worked hard digging that hill, but maybe you ought to consider boarding your family with one of the neighbors through January, just to be safe. You can test your burrow design during the spring shoulder season, in March or April, when the weather is forgiving. Do not risk your life in the middle of a Montana winter." "He will not be boarding with anyone," a clear woman's voice said from the doorway. It was Henrik's wife, Astrid. She had just walked into the mercantile, wrapping a woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders. She walked straight across the room, stood directly beside her husband, and looked the master builder right in the eye. She did not raise her voice, but there was an unshakable strength in her posture that startled the room. "We built our home together," Astrid said simply. "We know why it was designed this way, and we know it will stand." Brennan's jaw tightened. In Silver Bow County, nobody questioned his 20 years of building authority, especially not an immigrant woman. "Ma'am," Brennan said, softening his tone slightly, "I am not trying to disrespect your husband. I am trying to keep your family from freezing to death. That dirt structure is untested, dangerous, and violates every rule of Sound Frontier construction I know." "Then you do not know enough rules yet," Astrid replied quietly. A heavy silence fell over the store. Henrik picked up his flour sack, settled his account with the shopkeeper, and walked out into the snow with his wife. They did not shout, they did not argue, and they did not offer further defenses. Behind them, Brennan turned back to the crowd inside the store. "That man's stubborn pride is going to cost him everything," Brennan declared. "Mark my words right now. When that sod roof collapses, or that family comes begging for shelter, remember this afternoon. Remember that I tried to stop it." By Christmas, the story of the confrontation had spread to every homestead in the valley, and public opinion was overwhelmingly stacked against Henrik. Brennan was the established master craftsman. Henrik was just an eccentric foreigner with a shovel who thought he was smarter than 2 decades of territorial tradition. Social judgment cut deeper than technical arguments. Men at the local sawmill joked that Henrik was terrified of a real winter, hiding under the dirt like a hibernating prairie dog. Women expressed pity for Astrid, whispering that she had married a dreamer whose crazy ideas would leave her children shivering in the dark. The only person who refused to join the public mockery was an old Scottish trapper named John MacLeod. MacLeod was 71 years old, had lived in the Northern Rockies for over 40 years, and understood winter survival better than anyone alive. He said nothing during the tavern debates, but he quietly kept his eye on Henrik's hillside from a distance. MacLeod had traveled across North America and seen dozens of different indigenous shelter designs. He knew that just because a building looked strange to a European carpenter did not automatically mean it was wrong. On December 20th, Henrik, Astrid, and their young son officially moved into their earth-sheltered cabin. A thin, steady stream of clear smoke rose from the small stone chimney on the roof. The double-door tunnel airlock was sealed tight. The living grass on the roof lay buried beneath a light dusting of white snow, making the cabin virtually invisible against the sleeping hillside. Winter was about to test every single prediction. Here's what everyone missed about Henrik Voss's design. They looked at his hillside shelter and saw a primitive dirt pit because they were judging it using conventional building habits instead of thermodynamic science. Let that sink in for a moment. The first physical principle Henrik leveraged was the constant temperature of the Earth itself. If you dig 4 feet below the surface anywhere in Montana, the soil temperature remains remarkably stable all year round, hovering between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Think about that for a second. When the outdoor air drops to 30 below zero, a standard elevated log cabin is surrounded on all 6 sides, top, bottom, and 4 walls, by atmospheric air that is 30 below zero. The temperature gradient across those thin log walls is an incredible 85 degrees. Thermal energy leaps out of the house as fast as the fire can produce it. Henrik's cabin, on the other hand, was wrapped on 3 sides and along its entire floor by soil that never dropped below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. When his interior air was heated to 65 degrees, the temperature difference between his living room and his back earth wall was only 20 degrees, not 85. He was not starting his heating process from frozen solid. He was starting from a mild, cool basement temperature. Heating a space from 45 degrees up to 65 degrees takes a tiny fraction of the energy required to drag a drafty box up from 30 below. By nestling his living space back into that natural clay slope, Henrik had wrapped 3/4 of his home in a massive thermal blanket provided entirely free of charge by nature. That deep clay back wall was physically incapable of freezing. It could not leak heat into the open sky, and it completely blocked the ferocious mountain wind from touching his primary living quarters. The second physical triumph was his 6,000-pound sandstone interior wall. Brennan looked at that sandstone masonry wall and saw an expensive decorative partition, Henrik built it as a high-density thermal storage battery. Sandstone has a specific heat storage capacity roughly 4 times higher than atmospheric air by volume. When Henrik lit a small, hot fire inside his iron firebox, the intense heat was absorbed directly by the thousands of pounds of high-density rock sitting directly behind the stove. Because stone absorbs energy slowly and holds onto it with incredible tenacity, the sandstone battery did not instantly overheat the room. Instead, it stored thousands of British thermal units of energy deep inside its mineral mass. Hours later, long after the flames inside the firebox had died down to cold ashes, that massive stone wall continued to radiate gentle, steady, far-infrared warmth into the living quarters. It provided continuous heating throughout the 12 hours of darkness, completely eliminating the extreme temperature spikes and rapid midnight drops that plagued every traditional cabin in the territory. His neighbors built massive, roaring fireplaces because they were trying to heat the open air inside drafty rooms. But warm air has virtually no thermal mass. The moment a door opens, all that warm air instantly vanishes into the night, forcing the home to start heating from scratch. Henrik did not try to heat air. He heated mass. The third principle was the insulating power of his 18-inch sod roof. The local builders claimed 18 inches of soil was just useless, dangerous dead weight that would crush the ceiling beams. What they failed to realize was that soil held together by a dense network of living grass roots is one of the most effective, natural thermal insulators on planet Earth. The complex web of organic plant roots traps millions of microscopic pockets of dead air within the dirt matrix. Dead air is the foundation of almost all modern insulation. That 18-inch sod layer provided a thermal resistance value that no thin wooden roof covered in cedar shakes could ever hope to match. Furthermore, that heavy sod roof introduced a thermodynamic phenomenon known as thermal lag. When a sudden winter cold front swept down from Canada, dropping the air temperature by 30 degrees in a matter of 4 hours, the extreme cold could not penetrate 18 inches of earth right away. It took over 24 hours for a temperature shift to move through that thick soil layer. By the time the cold began to penetrate the top inches of soil, the atmospheric weather front had often already passed. The roof absorbed the thermal shock, keeping the interior living space perfectly stable. The fourth element was the double-door tunnel airlock. In a conventional frontier cabin, opening the front door during a winter storm allows a massive volume of freezing, high-pressure air to surge directly into the living room, instantly dropping the room temperature by 15 or 20 degrees in 5 seconds. Henrik's 8-foot tunnel completely eliminated that convective shock. When a family member opened the outer wooden door, cold air rushed into the unheated entryway tunnel. But because the inner door remained firmly closed, that cold air was trapped inside a dead air chamber. The person stepped inside the tunnel, closed the outer door, and only then opened the inner threshold. Because the tunnel was designed with a subtle upward incline leading into the house, heavy cold air naturally sank down toward the outer door sill, while lighter warm air stayed floating near the ceiling of the interior room. The airlock turned the entrance into a physical thermal trap, ensuring that cold draft could never breach the interior sanctuary. Finally, there was the brilliant passive ventilation system. Brennan predicted the family would suffocate or rot in a damp, smoke-filled hole, but Henrik had harnessed pressure differential ventilation. The intake vent on the eastern log wall was situated low to the ground, taking advantage of the natural positive wind pressure that built up against the exposed front face of the hill. The exhaust vent on the western side was positioned high near the roof peak, where wind sweeping over the smooth sod mound created a low-pressure suction effect. This continuous pressure differential created a gentle, unstoppable convective loop. Fresh, clean outdoor air was pulled slowly into the cabin through the low vent, warmed as it swept across the heated stone floor, rose toward the ceiling as it absorbed interior humidity, and was drawn out through the high exhaust tube by the natural vacuum above the roof. The airflow was slow, steady, and completely self-regulating. It exhausted interior moisture and cooking odors before they could condense on the wooden walls, yet it moved at a velocity far too gentle to pull stored heat out of the stone battery. Henrik had not built a primitive dugout. He had engineered a closed-loop, passive solar, high thermal mass earth shelter using nothing more than a pickaxe, local sandstone, native soil, Douglas fir logs, and an intimate understanding of the laws of nature. He did not need to debate Charles Brennan inside the mercantile store. He simply needed to wait for January to arrive. January 7th, 1884. The terrible cold arrived like something alive, ancient and ravenous. It started with the wind. Not the usual mountain breeze that settlers complained about over drinks, but an icy gale roaring down out of northern Canada with nothing to check its velocity. It howled across the exposed valleys at 35, 40, and sometimes 50 miles per hour, sustaining that terrifying force for days on end. Then, the temperature plummeted. By the morning of January 9th, outdoor thermometers hanging outside the Silver Bow Mercantile registered -8 degrees Fahrenheit. By January 10th, the mercury sank to -24. By January 11th, it plunged to -31 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, the atmosphere simply froze in place. For 11 straight days, the temperature never rose above -15, even at absolute peak afternoon sunlight. Atmospheric readings hovered continuously between -28 and -32 degrees Fahrenheit. The severe wind chill, a phenomenon locals simply called the bite, made the open air feel closer to -50 degrees. Exposed skin turned white with frostbite in under 2 minutes. Saliva froze solid before hit the snow. Men who were forced to step outside to tend livestock wore thick layers of heavy wool, oiled leather, and buffalo fur, yet still returned indoors, shaking so violently they could not hold a tin cup of coffee. Then the relentless snow began to fall. It accumulated relentlessly because the air was far too cold for melting to occur. 6 inches grew into 12, then 14 inches of dry, powdery powder. Wind drifts piled up 4 feet high against the north-facing walls of standard homes. Wagon roads became completely impassable. For 9 straight days, the entire settlement of Silver Bow County was physically cut off from the rest of Montana Territory. And then the firewood crisis hit. Here is the nightmare that no conventional builder had anticipated. When firewood is stacked outdoors in a normal winter, it remains cold, but relatively dry. But during 11 consecutive days of sub-zero gales and drifting powder, even sheltered wood stacks developed severe problems. Fine snow worked its way deep into every tiny gap between the logs. During the brief afternoon hours when sunlight warmed the bark slightly, that snow melted into moisture, only to refreeze into a solid sheet of glaze overnight. By January 12th, homesteaders were trying to feed their fireplaces with timber encrusted in ice. Ice does not burn. It melts, steams, and soaks into the raw grain of the wood, creating dense clouds of acrid smoke instead of heat. Chimneys choked with soot. Fireboxes sputtered and died. Families had to burn twice as much fuel, just to generate half as much heat, accelerating their wood consumption to terrifying levels. Inside the standard cabins built according to conventional frontier rules, the structural failure was total. Consider the Henderson family, living 2 miles south of Henricks Hill. They were burning 90 pounds of firewood every 24 hours inside their elevated cabin. At 2 in the afternoon, standing directly in front of their massive stone hearth, their interior thermometer registered 52 degrees Fahrenheit. 6 feet away from the fireplace, the room dropped into the low 40s. Their children slept in full winter coats, piled beneath every blanket, coat, and rug the family owned. They woke up with frozen frost on their breath, thick ice sheets forming on the inside of their glass windows, and genuine terror that the cold would breach their shelter before the storm broke. At the Johnson homestead, wind pressure shifted on the 6th day of the freeze, causing their tall stone chimney to reverse its draft. Thick wood smoke poured down into their living room instead of rising into the sky. They were forced to make an agonizing choice: open the windows and freeze, or close them and suffocate. They compromised by cracking windows open, bleeding whatever tiny scraps of heat they had generated. Samuel Cross, the timber merchant, became a desperate man. Not because he raised his prices, he was far too decent for that, but because his delivery wagons were trapped under 4-foot drifts. Families who had relied on buying wood throughout the winter were running out of fuel. Desperate men took axes to their own wooden dining tables, split up cedar fence posts, and chopped down barn doors just to keep their children alive through the night. Even Charles Brennan, the revered master builder, suffered inside his own home. He lived in a cabin he had designed personally, a textbook example of frontier architecture, featuring elevated piers, tight log walls, and a grand riverstone fireplace. He burned 105 pounds of split pine on January 13th, yet his indoor temperature plummeted to 48 degrees overnight. He woke up to find his kitchen water bucket frozen solid clear to the bottom. For the first time in 20 years, Brennan sat in the dark, wrapped in 2 wool blankets, and felt a cold knot of doubt forming deep inside his chest. On the afternoon of January 14th, old John McLeod decided to trek across the snow to check on the Norwegian immigrant. McLeod was 71 years old, possessed decades of wilderness survival experience, and knew that when temperatures dropped to -26 with 30-mile-an-hour gusts, inexperienced settlers died quietly in their beds. He carried his heavy snowshoes, a sharp hatchet, and extra rations, expecting to find a disaster on the Jacobson Hill. He expected to dig out a frozen family, or haul them back to his own camp. What he saw when he topped the ridge made him stop dead in his tracks. Henrik's earth cabin was almost invisible beneath the massive snowdrift covering the slope. The sod roof looked like a natural mound of white earth, except for 3 remarkable details. First, the snow surrounding the entrance tunnel had melted back slightly, leaving an open, clean 6-inch pathway. While 4-foot drifts choked every standard cabin doorway in the valley, Henrik's angled tunnel entrance was completely clear. Second, the short stone chimney poking up through the sod roof was emitting a thin, calm, continuous wisp of clear smoke. It was not the dark, chaotic billowing of a family desperately burning furniture, but the steady draft of a slow, controlled fire. And third, as McLeod stepped closer, he felt a faint wave of warmth rising from the tunnel mouth. He knocked firmly on the outer wooden door. He heard footsteps echoing along the tunnel, and then the outer door swung open. Henrik Voss stood in the doorway. He was wearing a light woolen work shirt. Just a shirt. No heavy coat, no fur vest, no layers of wool blankets. His shirt sleeves were rolled up past his forearms. His face was relaxed, his skin was warm, and his forehead bore faint beads of sweat. Behind him, through the inner doorway, McLeod could see the warm yellow glow of a lamp. He could smell dry pine heat and rich beef broth cooking on a stove. "Mr. McLeod," Henrik said, offering a warm smile, "step inside out of that wind. Is everything all right in the valley?" McLeod stood frozen in the snow, trying to process what his eyes were seeing. "How much wood have you burned today, Voss?" McLeod managed to ask, his voice hoarse from the wind. Henrik paused to calculate. "About 30 pounds this morning," he replied. "I will throw another 10 pounds into the firebox before we go to sleep tonight. So maybe 40 pounds total for the full day." "40 pounds?" McLeod repeated, his eyes wide. "Inside my house, I burned 85 pounds yesterday and could barely keep my water from freezing. What is your indoor temperature right now?" Henrik stepped back into the tunnel and pointed toward a small mercury thermometer hanging near the inner threshold. "Astrid checked it an hour ago," Henrik said. "It was sitting at 68 degrees. McLeod pulled off his thick fur gloves, stepped through the double-door airlock, and walked straight into the main room. The shock hit him instantly. It was not just warm. It was comfortably, dryly warm. There was no moisture dripping from the timber walls, no frost on the ceiling, and no smoke hanging in the air. The heavy stone floor radiated a gentle, soothing warmth upward through the soles of his boots. Astrid sat near the center of the room, calmly mending a shirt in her dress sleeves. Bjorn, the Norwegian elkhound, lay fully stretched out on the warm stone floor near the back sandstone wall, sleeping peacefully without a care in the world. McLeod walked over to that massive sandstone battery wall, removed his inner wool glove, and pressed his palm flat against the stone. The rock was deep, penetrating warm. It felt like touching a stone slab that had been baking in the July sun for 5 hours. "How long ago did you put wood on that firebox?" McLeod asked quietly. "About 7 hours ago," Henrik answered. "The fire is almost out. The stone holds the heat now." McLeod pulled out his trapper's notebook and began writing down every single measurement. Indoor temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outdoor temperature, minus 26 degrees Fahrenheit. A temperature differential of 94 degrees, maintained by 35 pounds of firewood. McLeod looked up at Henrik, closed his notebook, and said, "Charles Brennan told the whole town you would be dead by spring. I am walking straight to his cabin right now to tell him he is a complete fool." 2 days later, on January 16th, Charles Brennan arrived at the hillside cabin, accompanied by John McLeod, Samuel Cross, and Robert Dunlap. All four men had openly criticized the design in December. All four had predicted catastrophic structural failure. Henrik welcomed them inside one by one through the double-door airlock. What happened next was a moment of profound professional humility. Brennan walked slowly into the room, took off his heavy winter coat, and stood in silence. He checked the mercury thermometer himself. 67 degrees Fahrenheit while the wind outside roared at minus 29. He ran his calloused hands along the dry log timber walls, checking for condensation and finding none. He pulled out a steel measuring tape and recorded the dimensions of the firebox, the thickness of the 6,000-pound sandstone wall, and the exact placement of the low intake and high exhaust vents. He examined the 18-inch sod roof from below, checking the Douglas fir rafters for signs of sagging or moisture damage. The wood was bone dry, rock solid, and holding its load without a single crack. Samuel Cross, the timber merchant, stood near the wood stack inside the entryway tunnel. He realized with absolute clarity that while every family in the valley was burning 12 cords of wood to survive, Henrik's household would consume barely 4 cords. For the entire winter, a staggering 65% reduction in fuel consumption. Brennan closed his notebook, looked directly at Henrik in front of the gathered men, and cleared his throat. "I was wrong," Brennan said, his voice quiet and steady. "I told the mercantile crowd that this place was a funeral pyre. I said it would rot, freeze, or collapse. I was completely wrong about every single detail. You built a shelter that performs better than anything I have constructed in 20 years. Henrik offered no gloating and no harsh words. "You built using the rules you knew," Henrik replied gently. "I built using the rules the land provided." The next day, Brennan returned alone with a clean sketchbook. He spent 4 hours sitting at Henrik's table, drawing precise technical diagrams of the earth wall, the masonry thermal battery, the double-door airlock, and the convective air vents. "I am building one of these for myself next autumn," Brennan stated firmly. By late March, when the mountain snow finally began to thaw, the story of Henrik's earth shelter had completely transformed the building philosophy of the region. Between January 20th and March 1st, 43 different settlers traveled to the Jacobson Hill to inspect the cabin with their own eyes. They saw the dry timber, felt the thermal wall, measured the low wood consumption, and recognized the absolute triumph of the design. By the autumn of 1885, just 2 years after Henrik was mocked at the Mercantile, 26 families in Silver Bow County and the surrounding valleys had constructed earth-sheltered homes based on his principles. Charles Brennan himself constructed a large earth-sheltered home into a south-facing slope that very fall. During his first winter in his new shelter, he burned 5 cords of wood down from the 14 cords he had burned 2 years prior. In 1886, Henrik created a detailed, hand-drawn annotated building diagram explaining ground temperature stability, thermal battery proportions, airlock aerodynamics, and passive convective ventilation. He left copies of the diagram at the local store, free for any incoming homesteader to take. That simple diagram spread from homestead to homestead, across Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and the Dakota Territories. Henrik's original cabin stood strong for over 37 years, remaining completely dry, structurally sound, and exceptionally warm through decades of fierce mountain winters. The profound lesson of Henrik Voss's story is not simply about logs, dirt, and sandstone. It is a reminder that modern civilization often confuses newness with superiority. We frequently assume that complex, high-energy systems are superior to ancient, passive design principles refined by generations of practical human survival. Henrik did not invent thermal mass, sod insulation, or airlock entrances. He simply possessed the humility to remember what conventional builders had forgotten, that true engineering genius lies in working with the fundamental laws of physics rather than spending endless energy fighting against them. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Any modern application of earth-sheltered construction, thermal mass heating, or vernacular building techniques should be thoroughly evaluated according to current structural standards, modern safety guidelines, local building codes, and applicable zoning laws.